He was working um, with the, I want to say 26 in California. I can't think what, it's the city correction unit. Uh, I've known it so long as 26 in California, which is where they put the people in jail, and they hold them there for a while. If you go to 26 in California, you might be there for a short period of time before being moved to another correctional institution. And that's what he was doing. He was a guard there at that time. But he wanted to do something more than that, and he had begun to talk about getting deeper into politics and so forth. In fact, we had discussed his moving out of one ward to another where the opportunities were better for him to get higher political office, or at least more advantages than he was where he was at that time.
So his interest in politics was something that
was already there when I met him. Yes.
And he saw politics as what, a way to...
As a way. In Chicago at that time, for many African American men, it was an avenue that had not been presented before. There was a lot of movement going on in Chicago. People were moving from the Republican Party, and had begun to move from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, had begun to move from right around downtown area to the western side of Chicago, the Chicago West Side, had begun to move from the old core around 31st and what's now of South Park, but what is now King Drive, and moved further south. On the south side of Chicago, these African Americans were just, there was a lot of movement going on, and as that movement went on, more and more black people were replacing the white people who were the political bosses in those wards. And in order to get the kind of political support you needed to have in order to ask people to vote the way you wanted to in the Democratic machine, you had to have people who looked like you. And Mayor Daley, of course, recognized that fact. So he had big recruitment drives going on for precinct captains who were African Americans in those communities that were being taken over by African Americans. My husband was in a community, was in a ward, the 25th ward, which was largely Italian, very largely Italian. The ward committeeman was a man by the name of Vito Marzullo. My husband's uncle was the precinct captain in that ward, and the highest job that he was able to get for his people was either janitorial someplace or as a guard, and the job that he had for himself, which was doing something down at the city hall. As the West Side began to open up, there was a ward called the 24th Ward Democratic Organization. The first African American to be the ward leader there was a fellow by the name of Benjamin F. Lewis. Ben Lewis became the alderman and was seeking black precinct captains. So he approached my husband, that he had just met somewhere along the line, and asked him if he would leave 25th Ward, where his sponsorship was, to come to the 24th. So George, this was before we were married, George said, well, what did I think? And I thought it was a great opportunity. He said that he had thought it was a great opportunity. And what, did I think it would last? Not, we talked about it. So he decided to go to the 24th Ward. Once he got into the 24th Ward, he became what would now be called the AA to the alderman, Benjamin F. Lewis. Ben Lewis got himself killed.
What do you mean, got himself killed?
Well, somebody killed him. The newspapers claimed it was because he was in charge of the insurance in the ward. Now, let me explain this ward situation to you real fast. Whoever the committeeman was, Jake Harvey's was the committeeman. Jake Harvey of the old 24th Ward in Chicago was the committeeman. Ben was the alderman. Ben had been allowed to handle all of the insurance for all the stores, restaurants, whatever kind of business there was in the ward, because Jake Garvey had his other sources of income, whatever they were that he was doing. Ben tried to take over, the scuttlebutt is that Ben tried to take over more than he should have of the assets of the ward, and that he was killed. They shot him in the head. When Ben got himself killed, as I said, according to the newspapers, there was only one person left, who was the AA, who knew all the avenues that were there, and that was my husband, George. George then became the alderman of the 24th Ward.
Did it bother him that his predecessor had been shot to death?
It bothered us all to death. It bothered all of us, because it was right there in the ward office. As a matter of fact, George had gone to Northwestern to pick me up from school, and we had passed right by the office. We had to pass right by there to go home. And when we passed by there, the phone rang just as we were coming in the door. I guess we'd been there 4 or 5 minutes, and somebody said that George needed to come right away to the headquarters office because they had found Ben dead in the office. Well, of course, I wanted to go too. George said, no, I had to stay at home. I couldn't go. And so I stayed home, because women did what their husband said then. You know, that was a strange time in this country. But I did. But, you know, you did what your husband said on those awful days. But I stayed home and he went there. But anyway, after all this was over and done with, George then became the alderman, which didn't have, you know, he had the job of alderman, but he couldn't make all the big decisions, and he couldn't run the ward because the ward belonged to the ward committee man, who was the guy who was responsible for the votes that came out of the ward. And he was responsible directly to the mayor. Okay. First time the election came up for ward committeeman, George ran and became the committeeman. So he had the two most important jobs in the ward. That enabled him then to be able to say who was going to run, who was going to be selected to go before the Cook County Democratic Organization to become congressman later on down the road. And that's where his strength came from.
Uh-huh.
So it just moved right along.
So it sounds like he had a real kind of natural talent for dealing with the intricacies of the Democratic machine in Chicago, which is...
Well, yes, he did. George was very, very smart. But I like to say that I ran all of his campaigns because he was busy. And whenever, you know, we'd talk about a lot of things, about what we should do and how whether I should continue in school and blah, 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 and how he should go about, or whether he should go about staying into politics and all of that. But as far as we could see, there was just no other avenue that could take him where he wanted to go.
Where was that? Where did he want to go?
He wanted to earn as much money as he could. Our saying was, earn as much money as you can for the same 8 hours that you're going to put in. That was sort of our motto almost. So he knew that if he stayed in politics, that he would be able and do a good job. He could become the ward committeeman, or he could become the man in charge of the streets and sanitation in the ward. And there was a lot of money to be gotten that way. At that time, the city was open, or he could become another AA to another ward committeeman. And all those things were money-producing jobs.